Moving back to dry land, it's time to look at all of the droid army's ground vehicles. We're going to tackle these in two parts. First, we're going to look at the vehicles that were actually just large droids, and then we'll take a look at the actual vehicles. Let's begin with the spiders. The droid army had two classes of spider droid, the DSD-1 Dwarf Spider-Droid and the OG-9 Homing Spider-Droid, both designed for the Commerce Guild. Both droids, despite their names, moved on four legs which were joined around a central reactor ball. Dwarf spider droids were smaller, faster, and more intelligent, considered equivalent to SDAPs in the standard Separatist battle doctrine. They weren't all that tough, but their built-in laser cannons were powerful, suitable for use both as fast-firing anti-infantry weapons and more powerful anti-air artillery. OG-9 homing spider droids, meanwhile, were larger and more heavily armed, equivalent to A-80s. These droid walkers were each equipped with a powerful anti-personnel laser cannon and an even more powerful homing laser, the latter of which fired beams that could pulverize even AT-TE walkers. OG-9s were meant to work in conjunction with DSD-1s. A team of 4 dwarf spider droids would be linked and in constant contact with each homing spider droid, acting as scout and point defense for the larger vehicles. Dwarf spider droids would relay battlefield data back to their homing spider droids, alerting the less maneuverable walkers to hidden threats and potential targets. There was also the much rarer DSD Advanced Dwarf Spider Droid, which was much tougher than its smaller counterpart. It was heavily armored and armed, boasting a heavy blaster cannon and a set of fire-linked missile launchers. These rarely seen droid walkers could be devastating against infantry, but they were easily taken down by larger Republic vehicles. Other droid walkers in the Separatist arsenal included the LM-432 Crab Droid and the Octoptara Tri-Droids, both Techno-Union products. The Crab Droid was basically just an alternate version of the DSD-1 meant for use in rough terrain, especially swamps. It was slightly better armed, boasting twin blasters and vacuum jets that it could use to spray mud at enemy infantry, but its performance was overall comparable to the Dwarf Spider Droid. The Octoptara Tri-Droid, meanwhile, was larger and came in 2 variants. Each was a bubble-headed, 3-legged, omnidirectional walker, but they differed greatly in size. The Octoptara Combat Tri-Droid was an anti-personnel walker about the size of the ADSD. These were armed with anti-personnel laser cannons and sometimes also with sprayers for airborne pathogens. The Octoptara Magna Tri-Droid, on the other hand, was an absolute unit, a behemoth of a droid walker meant to lay waste to columns of enemy vehicles. For that purpose, it boasted either 3 heavy laser cannons or 3 heavy ordnance launchers, depending on the configuration. The last droid walker we have to cover is the Colicoid Scorpenek Annihilator droid. Annihilators were essentially everything that made droidekas deadly, but larger and more powerful. These battle droids were the size of tanks, armed with dual rapid-firing laser cannons, capable of shredding columns of AT-TEs. To add to this ridiculous level of firepower, Annihilators were shielded too, making them all but unstoppable. These army killers were rarely seen, but when they did make an appearance on the battlefield, they could wipe out whole platoons in short order. Other large Separatist droids functioned as tanks, either conventional or Repulsorlifts. There were 3 Repulsorlift droid tanks in use by the Confederacy: the GAT and HAG, both Bactoid Armor Workshop products, and the Proto-Deka, which was more unique. The Ground Armored Tank, or GAT, was essentially the Separatist equivalent of the Republic TX-130 fighter tank. Originally commissioned by the IGBC, this light tank was extremely fast, lightly armored, and well armed, equipped with a pair of long-range medium laser cannons and a pair of missile launchers. It was typically used as a fast attack craft or an armored scout, and it was often deployed in conjunction with STAPs. The Heavy Artillery Gun, or HAG for short, came in 2 variants and originated as a Trade Federation mobile artillery piece. The original HAG was based on the design of the MTT, thus it was heavily armored, slow, and lacked maneuverability. Like the MTT, the HAG featured a pair of turreted point defense laser cannons on its nose to ward off infantry or light vehicles. Its main weapon, however, was a huge heavy energy projectile cannon which could be used to shell enemy emplacements at long range. This weapon was so powerful that the vehicle had to be anchored in place with repulsor lift stabilizers when it was firing. The other variant, the HAG-M, more closely resembled the AAT, but it was still heavily armored, slow, and not very maneuverable. It lacked any secondary weapons, featuring only its heavy energy projectile cannon, which functioned more as a large mortar, hence the "M" at the end of the HAG-M's name. The HAG-M's main gun was slightly less powerful than the standard HAGs, but could be fired while the tank was still moving and had a higher rate of fire. The Proto-Deka, meanwhile, was a beast of a craft dreamed up by the Colicoids and made a reality by the Geonosians. These Repulsorlift tanks were incredibly well armored and armed to the teeth, as you would expect for a Colicoid craft. Instead of the usual laser cannons that most tanks employed, Proto-Dekas were equipped with full-on light turbo lasers, as well as rapid-firing concussion missile launchers and a seismic wave emitter. They could obliterate virtually anything that stood in their path, including some of the Republic's most heavily armored vehicles. The two other droid tanks in the droid army's arsenal were more well-known and conventional wheeled vehicles. These were the Corporate Alliance NR-N99 Persuader class droid tank and the IGBC IG-227 Hailfire class droid tank. The Persuader, more commonly known as the Corporate Alliance tank droid or the Snail tank, was a small-sized tracked droid tank, moderately armored and armed with 2 ion cannons and 2 heavy repeating blasters. They weren't all that remarkable on their own, but they were usually deployed in large columns, in which they were a force to be reckoned with. Snail tanks weren't all that maneuverable, but they were pretty good at ploughing straight ahead through obstacles, which they preferred to trying to navigate around them. Both the Corporate Alliance tank and the Hailfire droid were considered equivalent to the Trade Federation AAT in the standard Separatist battle plan. The Hailfire droid was a fast-moving, lightly armored hoop-wheeled craft designed for rapid, devastating assaults. Armed with a retractable anti-personnel laser cannon and 2 racks of heat-seeking missiles, these vehicles could annihilate a platoon of clone troopers or a column of ATTEs in seconds. However, they only had 30 missiles, and once those were gone, they were pretty much useless. This led them to being pulled from the droid army's roster for most of the Clone Wars. They returned at the end of the conflict, now paired with airborne refresh droids that could rearm them mid-battle, but by that point, they had been pretty thoroughly sidelined. Now on to the actual vehicles, all of which were repulsor craft. Starting off, we have the droid army's primary speeder model, the single trooper aerial platform, a kind of airhook regularly used by the CIS. The STAP enhanced the mobility, visual range, and firepower of individual battle droids, and they were usually deployed as scouts, pursuit craft, or as battlefield surveillance craft. In the latter case, they were deployed to act as eyes in the sky for the central control computer, providing a bird's eye view of the battlefield. STAPs were respectably fast and armed with a pair of repeating dual blaster cannons, which made them suitably effective in combat. Much larger than the STAP was the Armored Assault Tank, or AAT, the primary armored vehicle of the droid army. These densely armored repulsor craft were manned by a crew of 4, 1 pilot, 2 to 3 gunners, and sometimes a commander. These craft were slow but incredibly tough, and they had considerable firepower, consisting of a turreted heavy laser cannon, 2 dual repeating blaster cannons, 2 fixed light blaster cannons, and 6 ordnance launchers, which fired missiles cocooned in energy shells. The ordnance launchers were compatible with high explosive bunker buster shells, armor-piercing anti-tank rounds, and standard high energy shells. All told, the AAT could be incredibly destructive, and it was the most formidable and well-rounded core tank of the droid army. The droid army sometimes made use of an experimental variant of the AAT, the defoliated deployment tank. Designed during the war, the DDT was basically an AAT with its top turret replaced with a large defoliated cannon, which fired powerful incendiary shells capable of annihilating living beings across a large area while leaving droids unharmed. The DDT was deployed very selectively, but it could be devastating in the right environment, such as forests or highly flammable grasslands. The defoliator was ultimately a specialty weapon, but it was an important part of the Separatist arsenal nonetheless. The final vehicle in the droid army's arsenal was the Bactoid Armor Workshop Supertank, a shielded heavy tank that, fortunately for the Republic forces, was very rare. These tanks were operated by a crew of 2, a pilot and a gunner, and they were both densely armored and equipped with powerful ray shields, which made the Supertank all but invincible. These craft could advance into even the fiercest battle zones unscathed before unleashing a devastating barrage of fire. Supertanks were armed with 2 twin blaster cannons, 2 turreted twin laser cannons, and 2 concealed warhead launchers, the latter of which could obliterate any vehicle in the Republic arsenal from extreme range. The Supertank's only weakness was its price tag, which prevented it from being manufactured en masse.